And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow. You know, many years ago, the poet William Blake said this. He said, just as the caterpillar chooses the fairest leaves on which to lay its eggs, so too does the priest choose the fairest joys on which to lay his curse. Now, I don't know if Burning Man is the fairest joy of our modern society, but I hear it was a lot of fun. We may want to, in today's world, replace the word priest with billionaire, whether it's the billionaire Sean Parker taking over a beautiful forest glade in order to have his wedding and cause a fair amount of environmental damage, which, to be fair, he repaired, or whether it's Burning Man. It seems that billionaires are everywhere nowadays, especially if it's beautiful or fun. And here to talk about that now with us is Keith Spencer. Keith A. Spencer. He is a PhD student at the University of California in Santa Cruz. He is a freelance writer, and he is a retired burner. Keith, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, RJ.
So listen, you wrote a piece for Salon called, or for Jacobin, actually, excuse me, called Why the Rich Love Burning Man. And, I remember when Burning Man, I never went, but I wanted to, actually. I remember when it was still a fairly new thing, and it was very counterculture, and it seemed to be kind of socialistic, left libertarian, but emphasis on the left, kind of hippie-ish. It's changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's I think nowadays when people think Burning Man, they probably first think of Silicon Valley, whereas maybe 10, 15 years ago, they think of, hippies and nudists and something a little different than
right.
what it's definitely associated with now.
So what happened? Was it just that the Silicon Valley elite decided it was a cool thing to do? How did they wind up taking it over?
So that's a great question. I mean, so my basic what my article is about and what I sort of centers this around was like the idea that because Burning Man never really had anything really, really radical baked into it, it could easily become taken over by, other people with other interests and sort of become a rich person's festival. It's interesting because I don't know if you've heard, or your listeners have heard of the Bohemian Club.
I have. Our listeners may not have, but tell us about it.
So the Bohemian Club was a sort of social club in San Francisco that was founded by these artists and sort of radical thinkers, bohemians, obviously, in the title, around the turn of the century. And they had a need to bring in some more money, so they started letting in businessmen, and it was an all-men's club at the time. And pretty quickly, businessmen ended up taking it over entirely because it never really had any really well-defined, sort of core principle or anything like that. So it wasn't, even though it had the word bohemian in the title, these sort of high-powered businessmen came in. And nowadays it's most known as sort of exclusively the provenance of like rich Republicans and conservatives. They have this big building in downtown San Francisco, and it's often the only place that conservatives, sort of politicians like the Bushes, will go when they go to San Francisco. They'll drive straight to the Bohemian Club. And they also have this sort of creepy, kind of like fenced-off redwood grove up north in Marin. But I would say Burning Man, it's kind of the same thing has happened, where, there wasn't really, I mean, they let everyone, they were egalitarian that they let anybody who could buy a ticket come in, but there wasn't anything to shy away people who may not have been as interested in certain, the certain aspects of the festival that sound sort of radical, like the gift economy.
Right, and let's talk about that, just so that our listeners understand, who may not be that familiar with Burning Man, that there was supposedly an ethos there, right? And the ethos said that you don't buy and sell, you can barter, you can exchange, but basically you take care of one another. So it all sounded very communitarian, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it had these sort of 10 principles it was founded on, and among them were these tenets like radical self-inclusion and radical self-expression. And it was, like you said, it was a gift economy, so money can't change hands. You have to bring a lot of stuff to sort of give away. But I mean, what I think has changed, what really rankles the older burners now that's been happening is that, whereas before, people would kind of bring in their own camps and build them themselves. A lot of wealthy attendees have just pay other people to build stuff for them. So they come in and they have this camp all pre-set up for them. And in terms of like actually constructing the temporary society, it's become more for certain aspects of it. It's become more exclusive, and it's become reliant on other people's labor. Many of whom have written these sort of exposés of their experience being exploited by some of these like rich billionaire Silicon Valley types.
Yeah. So, and it seems to me, I know they've described. We're talking with freelance writer Keith Spencer. It seems to me, they've described how they would set up these exclusive camps. The implicit assumption behind those 10 principles was, everybody can go everywhere and so on. But soon they were setting up these camps where basically you couldn't get in without invitation, and maybe they were closed off in some way. And so there was exclusivity, and there was enormous privilege and comfort. It had a kind of do-it-yourself, DIY ethos to it, and all of a sudden people were paying others to do everything in order to let them live in a life of luxury. So I guess the people running it were just like not paying attention, or didn't think it was a violation of the principles, or what?
Well, you could definitely make the argument that at the institutional level, Burning Man, it's been occupied by a lot of these wealthier people. This guy Jim Tannenbaum, who's the venture capitalist, who kind of a lot of the ire has been directed towards recently, and he actually resigned from the board after this whole thing happened, where he hired some people to build the camp for him, and they were working like 20 hours days, and everything was a mess. But people like him are the type of people that are on the board. I mean, a lot of the founders have been totally fine with having some of these kind of like I think they kind of like the Silicon Valley star power. I mean, it's a nonprofit. It's not a democracy, and I think that's one of the kind of interesting things that you see. I mean, so this is why I wrote this article about Burning Man, is because I think it kind of reflects a lot of things that are happening in our day-to-day society, where like a lot of the sort of wealthiest people in the country, they won't say outright that they hate democracy, but they want to live in a world.
Well, at least one did. Peter Thiel, the venture capitalist, did say that he doesn't like democracy, that it all went to hell when poor people, he didn't use those words, but when poor people and women got the vote. So, some of them will say it, but most won't.
Absolutely. No, and there is this really kind of frightening, burgeoning anti-democratic libertarian movement that's centered in Silicon Valley, actually.
Right, and funded by it to a large extent, yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But, it's kind of like, what happens when you have a society built by democracy versus when you have one built by charity? And, in a world, or charity or donations, I should say, because in a world like Burning Man, which is, a temporary city in its own right, all the pieces are brought by the people who come. But, of course, the people who have more can afford to bring more. And then, unsurprisingly, they wield more power with the board of directors, and, they bring their sort of elitist world with them. And so it shouldn't be surprising that Burning Man is sort of the same types of social inequalities that we see in the United States. I mean, it's demographically, it's much wider. It exhibits like similar sort of income inequality, even more extreme in a sense, because there's a lot of very low income people who go, and then a small number of super rich people who go. It's unsurprising that these kind of rich libertarian types love it, because it's a world where they, can use their money to have more power. I mean, democracy is not just about bringing the small, bringing the voices of the unheard to the forefront, but it's also about making sure that the people who have too much power don't get more of a voice. And Burning Man is sort of the opposite of that. It allows those with a lot of power and money to have a much louder voice.
That's why I thought your piece was so noteworthy. We're talking with Keith A. Spencer, freelance writer, because it points out that into this vacuum, perhaps inevitably, came the domination of money and the few over the many, at least in certain ways, and a subversion of the values on which it was founded, an argument one might incidentally also make about our country. And so I thought, as an analogy, it functioned really well. By the way, parenthetically, Keith, I will say also that the creation of a large straw man who is then set on fire and burnt to a cinder is not a bad metaphor for the economics of the Silicon Valley either.
Absolutely.
So where do you see this going? You yourself you've described yourself as a retired burner. Is it because of all this that you stopped going?
Well, it's funny because I was, I'm part of this kind of very specific subset of millennials who graduated from college exactly at the peak of the recession. And, like I lived in the Bay Area, and like a lot of other people in around 2009, we were fresh out of college, and we had really nowhere to go, and it was really hard to find a job that used our skills. And so that took me to try to sort of discover, see if I could find alternative economic arrangements or alternative ways of living, because there just didn't seem like there was anything for me in the sort of everyday capitalist economy. And so, in the sort of 2 years after college, I went around and I went and visited a bunch of communes, and I went to Cuba, and I went. One of the things I checked out was Burning Man, and I was sort of excited because it sounded so radical. It sounded so out there. It sounded like a totally different way of living and interacting, and I thought maybe this could be sort of herald some type of different world or inspire people. And I was kind of disappointed just at how it kind of reproduced a lot of the same social inequalities that I'd seen in the Bay Area and in the country at large, and it also sort of became the provenance of these very rich tech people who brought their own exclusivity to it.
It's interesting because I've also seen this cultural appropriation take place on the part of the rich. Rock and roll music was at one point a symbol of social rebellion and the demand for political, economic, and social change. And now we've had these with Tom Petty playing the $10 million bar mitzvah for the guy, or bat mitzvah, I forget which it was, for the child of the defense manufacturer who manufactured defective Kevlar vests for soldiers in Iraq. We have this sort of, in other words, the counterculture, which was at one point supposed to be, and perhaps was, an instrument for positive social change, itself seems to have been largely commandeered by the wealthy for their own amusement. What do you think of that thought?
Yeah, you could probably say the same thing of hip-hop or punk music, too. It's interesting because it sort of goes back to who pulls the strings and who controls and owns, like, the media that we see. Most of the large music, most of the music we hear is routed through, 4 or 5 record labels, right? And those are all owned by very, very wealthy people, and their interests are not in, distributing music that sort of does anything but toe the party line. So once in a while, there can be artists, I think, who are so popular that they just have to sort of grin and bear it and produce their music just because it sells so well, even though they're saying things that are questionable to the kind of ruling class. But generally, it seems like we're sort of more passive in terms of consuming art and music. We're kind of subject to whatever the sort of owners of these like large media conglomerates want us to hear and think and believe and so on.
Keep you dope with religion and sex and TV, and you think you're so clever and classless and free. That was John Lennon in 1970. And now we can add rock and roll and hip-hop and popular entertainment and maybe Burning Man to that as well. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Keith A. Spencer, freelance writer. By not going this year, I'm told that you missed the opportunity to see Katy Perry fall off a Segway, which is another metaphor, I think, for the whole venture. But Keith, thanks so much for writing this piece, and thanks for coming on the program.
Certainly. Thanks for having me.
You bet.